September 12, 1944. A makeshift field hospital outside Aachen, Germany. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter regained consciousness to a sight that defied everything he'd been taught about warfare, about enemies, about the natural order of combat. An American medic, his uniform marked with the Red Cross insignia, was wrapping Richter's shattered leg with careful precision, murmuring reassurances in broken German. The morphine coursing through Richter's veins couldn't dull his confusion as much as his pain. This wasn't supposed to happen. The enemy didn't save you. They finished you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Richter had commanded the 89th Infantry Regiment's 3rd Battalion for 18 months, surviving the Eastern Front's frozen hell and the grinding attrition of the Italian campaign before his transfer west. He'd seen what happened to captured Soviet soldiers. He'd witnessed the treatment of partisans, the disposal of wounded enemies left in the snow to freeze or bleed out depending on which came first. He'd read the directives, heard the speeches, absorbed the ideology that separated humanity into categories of worth. The untermensch didn't deserve mercy. The Bolshevik deserved extermination. Now, lying on an American stretcher with his femur shattered by shrapnel from his own regiment's artillery, watching this young corporal from Nebraska change his dressing and check his vital signs, Richter confronted a cognitive dissonance so profound it hurt worse than his wounds. The American medical tent smelled of antiseptic and canvas, a sharp contrast to the cordite and blood that had filled Richter's nostrils during the battle. Around him, 24 wounded men lay on cots in various states of injury. 3 were American soldiers wounded in the same engagement that had nearly killed Richter. The rest were German, prisoners like himself, receiving identical treatment from the same medical staff. A surgeon wearing captain's bars moved between patients without apparent discrimination, assessing wounds, issuing orders to his assistants, administering medication. When he reached Richter's cot, the captain examined the lead wound with professional detachment. The break is clean but the soft tissue damage is extensive. We'll need to debride the wound again tomorrow and watch for infection. Keep him on sulfa drugs and maintain the morphine schedule. The pain will be significant for at least a week. The captain spoke to his orderly in English, but Richter understood enough to grasp the meaning. They were planning his treatment, discussing his recovery, investing resources in keeping an enemy soldier alive. The contradictions multiplied with every passing hour. Richter's indoctrination had been thorough and systematic. The Wehrmacht Officer Training Academy at Dresden had devoted entire semesters to ideological education alongside tactical instruction. Professor Dr. Wilhelm Hartmann, a fervent party member with academic credentials that lent authority to propaganda, had lectured extensively on the biological realities of racial hierarchy. Hartmann's course, mandatory for all officer candidates, laid out the scientific basis for Germany's struggle with clinical precision. The American soldier represents a mongrel population lacking true racial consciousness. Their nation, built on capitalist exploitation and Jewish financial manipulation, produces fighting men without the spiritual strength of the German Volk. They are soft, corrupted by materialism and democratic weakness. Their treatment of prisoners will reflect this degeneracy. Expect no mercy, for they understand only brutality tempered by sentimentality that makes them unpredictable and dangerous. Hartmann had been specific about medical care. In American captivity, you may observe superficial medical attention designed for propaganda purposes. Do not mistake this for genuine care. They will photograph healthy prisoners for newsreels while those who cannot be displayed die from neglect. Their medical resources serve their own troops exclusively. Any treatment of German prisoners exists solely for intelligence exploitation or public relations. Remember this when facing capture. Death is preferable to the humiliation and abuse that awaits in enemy hands. The lectures had been reinforced by newsreels showing Allied atrocities, by whispered stories of prisoners tortured for information, by official reports of POW camps where German soldiers starved while their captors lived in luxury. The Eastern Front had provided its own brutal education about what happened to captured soldiers. Richter had seen the bodies of German troops retaken from Soviet positions, the evidence of torture, the casual brutality of a war without rules or mercy. He'd internalized the lesson that combat was total, that capture meant death or worse than death, that the enemy was fundamentally other and incapable of the honor and humanity that supposedly characterized German military tradition. Yet here, in this tent outside Aachen, American medics were saving his life. The cognitive dissonance created a pressure in Richter's skull that rivaled his physical pain. His training insisted this was temporary, a prelude to abuse once the cameras stopped rolling and the intelligence officers finished their work. His eyes, however, reported something different. The medics moved with practiced efficiency born of genuine expertise, not theatrical performance. They joked with each other while working, displaying the casual camaraderie of professionals confident in their skills. When a young German soldier 2 cots over began screaming from pain, an American orderly rushed to his side immediately, checking his morphine drip and adjusting the dosage without waiting for permission or supervision. The test came on Richter's second day of captivity. Infection set into his leg wound despite the sulfa drugs, red streaks climbing toward his groin with deadly intent. The American surgeon examined the wound with obvious concern, then turned to his staff. "We need to operate now or we'll lose him to sepsis. Prep the surgical tent and get me 2 units of plasma. Tell the anesthesiologist we're doing a fasciotomy in 20 minutes. The words penetrated Richter's fevered consciousness with stunning implications. They were going to perform surgery, real surgery requiring anesthesia and plasma and scarce medical resources, on an enemy prisoner who provided no intelligence value and represented nothing but a drain on their supplies. The logical part of Richter's mind insisted this was impossible, that he'd misunderstood through his fever, that surely they would simply let nature take its course and save their plasma for American soldiers. Instead, orderlies lifted his stretcher and carried him to a separate tent where bright surgical lights hung over an operating table sterilized and prepared with the same care as any civilian hospital. The anesthesiologist, a soft-spoken lieutenant from Philadelphia, explained the procedure in careful German while preparing the ether mask. "We're going to put you to sleep and relieve the pressure in your leg. The infection has caused swelling that's cutting off blood flow. Without surgery, you'll likely lose the leg or die from blood poisoning. With surgery, your chances of full recovery are good. You'll feel some pressure as you go under, then nothing until you wake up. We'll manage your pain afterward. Do you understand?" Richter managed a nod, his mind reeling. The lieutenant's German was heavily accented but comprehensible, suggesting deliberate study rather than casual exposure. Someone had trained this man to communicate with German patients, had invested time and resources in ensuring German prisoners could understand their medical care. The absurdity of the situation overwhelmed Richter as the ether mask descended. His last conscious thought before darkness claimed him was that he'd awakened in some alternative reality where the natural laws of warfare had been suspended. He woke to discover his leg still attached, heavily bandaged but present and beginning to heal. The fever had broken. The red streaks were fading. American medical science, applied with the same vigor and expertise they devoted to their own wounded, had pulled him back from death's threshold. In the cot beside him, a young soldier named Friedrich Werner stared at the tent ceiling with the 1,000-yard gaze Richter recognized from 100 battlefields. Werner had taken a machine gun burst across his abdomen during a failed counterattack, wounds that should have killed him within hours. Instead, American surgeons had spent 6 hours rebuilding his shredded intestines, transfusing blood, fighting for a life that belonged to someone who'd been trying to kill them days earlier. The 2 Germans began talking during the long hours of recovery, sharing their confusion and attempting to reconcile their observations with their training. Werner, a farm boy from Bavaria drafted at 18 and thrust into combat with minimal preparation, articulated what both were thinking. "My unit commander told us the Americans would torture prisoners, that capture meant death after interrogation. He said they were savages hiding behind their technology, that they'd shoot wounded Germans rather than waste resources on us. But these doctors, these medics, they're trying harder to save us than our own medical corps tried when we were fighting for Germany. What does that mean? What are we supposed to think?" Richter had no answer. His officer training provided frameworks for tactics, logistics, combat leadership, and ideological indoctrination. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It offered nothing useful for processing genuine humanity from an enemy he'd been taught to view as subhuman mongrels incapable of honor or mercy. The evidence accumulated daily. American medics worked 18-hour shifts caring for German wounded with the same dedication they showed their own casualties. Surgical teams performed complex procedures on prisoners that exceeded what German field hospitals attempted for Wehrmacht soldiers. Plasma arrived regularly from the United States, stockpiled specifically for POW treatment. Sulfa drugs, morphine, bandages, anesthesia, all the materials of modern military medicine flowed to German prisoners in quantities that suggested systematic planning rather than propaganda gestures. The American medical system's scope became apparent as Richter recovered enough to observe the broader operation. The field hospital outside Aachen was one link in an extensive chain designed to move wounded prisoners from the front lines through successive stages of care. Forward aid stations stabilized critically wounded Germans within hours of capture, applying the same golden hour principles that saved American lives. Ambulances evacuated prisoners alongside American casualties, with medical priority determined solely by wound severity rather than nationality. Field hospitals like the one holding Richter provided surgical intervention and intensive care. Evacuation hospitals behind the lines offered longer-term treatment. Hospital ships transported seriously wounded prisoners to facilities in England and eventually America itself for extended rehabilitation. The logistics required to build and maintain this system staggered Richter's comprehension. Someone in the American command structure had decided that German prisoners deserved medical care equivalent to American soldiers, then allocated the resources to make that decision reality. Ships crossing the Atlantic carried plasma and medication designated for enemy wounded. Factories in American industrial heartland produced bandages and surgical instruments that would save German lives. Doctors and nurses, trained at enormous expense, devoted their skills to healing men who'd been killing Americans days or weeks earlier. The investment in German POW medical care represented a strategic choice that contradicted everything Richter understood about warfare's brutal mathematics. By late September, Richter could move with crutches, his leg healing with a speed that amazed him. The American doctors predicted full recovery, possibly with a slight limp but with complete function restored. They discussed his case with professional satisfaction, pleased with their surgical outcomes and confident in their techniques. The surgeon who'd operated on Richter stopped by his cot one evening, accompanied by a young lieutenant who served as translator. The captain wanted to explain the procedure they had performed and discuss rehabilitation. The fasciotomy relieved pressure that would have killed tissue and likely cost you the leg. We removed some damaged muscle but preserved the bone and major blood vessels. The infection responded well to sulfa treatment once we eliminated the trapped fluid. You'll need physical therapy to regain full strength, but there's no reason you shouldn't walk normally within 6 months. The American Army operates rehabilitation facilities for prisoners of war where you'll receive the same therapy our own wounded soldiers get. You're young and healthy otherwise. This injury won't define the rest of your life. The translator, a bookish second lieutenant from Minnesota, rendered the explanation into formal German, then added his own observation. The captain is one of our best surgeons. He trained at Johns Hopkins before the war. He's performed this procedure hundreds of times. You were fortunate to have him operating. Richter absorbed this information with mounting bewilderment. The Americans had assigned a Johns Hopkins trained surgeon to a forward field hospital treating enemy wounded. They deployed world-class medical talent to save German soldiers who provided no military value and represented nothing but a resource drain. The investment made no sense from any strategic perspective Richter could identify. His confusion deepened as other prisoners arrived with similar stories. Wehrmacht soldiers wounded in the Hürtgen forest battles arrived with detailed surgical repairs that exceeded anything available in German field hospitals. Waffen-SS troops, indoctrinated even more thoroughly than regular army in racial ideology and expectations of enemy brutality, discovered American medics treating them identically to other prisoners despite their unit affiliations. Paratroopers who dropped into Market Garden and been wounded in the fighting at Arnhem received care that saved limbs and lives they'd expected to lose. Each new arrival brought the same stunned realization that American medical treatment bore no resemblance to the torture and neglect they'd been promised. The psychological impact on German prisoners manifested in ways that alarmed and confused the American medical staff. Some prisoners refused treatment initially, convinced the care was a trap designed to extract intelligence or create propaganda. They had to be persuaded that American doctors genuinely intended to heal them, that accepting treatment wouldn't obligate them to betrayal or collaboration. Other prisoners broke down emotionally when they grasped that their wounds would actually heal, that they would survive injuries they'd accepted as death sentences. The cognitive dissonance between ideological preparation and lived reality created a kind of mental whiplash that required processing. Friedrich Werner articulated this confusion one night as the two Germans lay in adjacent cots, listening to autumn rain drum against the tent canvas. We were taught that Americans were soft, that they lacked the hardness necessary for total war. We were told they'd crack under pressure, that their mongrel democracy produced inferior soldiers. But these medics work harder than anyone I saw in our medical corps. These surgeons display more skill than the doctors who treated our own wounded. They've saved my life when my own army would have left me to die for lack of resources. What does that mean about everything else we were taught? If they lied about this, what other lies did we believe? Richter had been wrestling with identical questions. The systematic nature of American POW medical care suggested it wasn't accidental or merely propaganda-driven. Someone had made a policy decision that German prisoners deserved treatment, then built the infrastructure to implement that policy at scale. The decision couldn't be explained by softness or sentimentality, not when it required such extensive planning and resource allocation. Something else was driving American behavior, some principle or ideology that Richter's training had never prepared him to encounter. The answer began emerging through conversations with American medical personnel who'd learned enough German to communicate beyond simple commands. The bookish translator, Lieutenant James Henderson, proved particularly willing to discuss American thinking about prisoner treatment. Henderson had studied European history at the University of Chicago before the war, spoke fluent German acquired through academic study, and possessed the intellectual curiosity to explore questions that most combat soldiers avoided. During one of his visits to check on Richter's rehabilitation progress, Henderson brought a worn copy of the Geneva Convention protocols and spent an evening explaining American adherence to international law regarding prisoner treatment. The United States is a signatory to the Geneva Convention of 1929, which establishes minimum standards for POW treatment. Article 14 specifically requires that prisoners receive medical care equivalent to what the capturing nation provides its own troops. We're not being generous or soft. We're following international law that America helped create and that we believe serves everyone's interests. Richter examined the French and English text, struggling with the legal language but grasping the essential points. The conventions established rules for warfare, including prisoner treatment, that signatory nations agreed to follow. America was fulfilling treaty obligations, operating within a legal framework that existed independent of immediate military necessity. The concept of binding international law that constrained military action seemed almost absurd to someone trained in total war ideology, yet the evidence of its operation surrounded him. Henderson continued his explanation, warming to a topic he'd clearly considered deeply. There's also pragmatic calculation behind the policy. When German soldiers know they'll receive proper medical care if captured, they're more likely to surrender rather than fight to the death. That saves American lives. It shortens battles and reduces casualties on both sides. Treating prisoners well also encourages reciprocal treatment of American POWs in German hands. We're aware that doesn't always work, especially on the Eastern Front, but we maintain our standards regardless because we believe it's right and because abandoning those standards would make us no different from our enemies. The translator's words introduced concepts that struck Richter as simultaneously naive and profound. Americans apparently believed that maintaining moral standards during war served practical purposes, that adhering to laws and treaties provided strategic advantages, that treating enemies humanely produced military benefits beyond propaganda value. The framework suggested a fundamentally different conception of warfare than what Richter had learned at Dresden. Total war ideology treated conflict as existential struggle between incompatible peoples where only victory or annihilation mattered. American thinking apparently conceptualized war as a limited activity bound by rules, where even enemies retained rights and dignity that must be respected. The distinction became clearer as Richter observed how American medical personnel approached their work. They displayed professional pride in surgical outcomes regardless of the patient's nationality. They competed to achieve better survival rates and faster recovery times for all patients under their care. They discussed challenging cases with the same intellectual engagement whether the wounded man was American or German. The work itself seemed to matter more than the identity of who benefited, as though healing was an end worth pursuing independent of national loyalty or military necessity. This attitude pervaded the entire medical system. When plasma supplies ran short during heavy fighting in October, the allocation formula distributed the scarce resource based on medical need rather than nationality. German prisoners with the most critical injuries received transfusions while American soldiers with less severe wounds waited. The decision reflected medical triage principles applied without discrimination, prioritizing lives that could be saved over tribal loyalty. Richter watched an American corporal with a relatively minor leg wound cheerfully yield his place in the treatment queue to Friedrich Werner, whose abdominal injuries required immediate intervention. The corporal joked with the medics about Germans getting preferential treatment, then asked them to save some plasma for when his turn came. The incident crystallized something for Richter about American military culture that his training had completely failed to predict. These soldiers possessed confidence in their system's abundance, believing that helping an enemy wouldn't deprive them of necessary care. They trusted that more supplies would arrive, that the logistical pipeline would keep functioning, that resources existed for everyone who needed them. This confidence enabled generosity impossible in a scarcity mindset, where every bandage given to an enemy represented one less available for your comrades. Germany's medical system operated under permanent scarcity, with resources flowing preferentially to SS units and vital combat formations while regular Wehrmacht troops made do with less. Field hospitals rationed care based on military value, with seriously wounded soldiers sometimes abandoned to free resources for troops who could return to combat quickly. The Eastern Front had brutalized medical practice entirely, with triage decisions becoming calculations of racial worth and strategic importance rather than medical need. Against this background of systemic scarcity and ideological hierarchy, American abundance and egalitarian treatment seemed almost incomprehensible. By November 1944, Richter had been transferred to a larger POW hospital complex near Brussels where German prisoners requiring extended care received rehabilitation and physical therapy. The facility occupied a former Belgian asylum, its spacious wards and therapy rooms converted into a military hospital that housed over 800 German wounded at any given time. The scale of American commitment to German POW medical care became fully apparent in this environment. Physical therapists worked with German soldiers to restore mobility and function to injured limbs. Occupational therapists taught new skills to prisoners who'd lost hands or suffered other disabilities. Psychiatric services were available for soldiers dealing with combat trauma, though few Germans initially sought such help due to cultural stigma and suspicion of American intentions. The hospital staff included American medical personnel supplemented by German doctors and medics captured in the fighting and pressed into service caring for their own countrymen. These German medical officers provided crucial perspective on both systems, having worked within Wehrmacht medical services before experiencing American approaches. Oberarzt Heinrich Kessler, a surgeon from Munich who'd been captured during the Falaise Gap battles, served as senior German medical officer at the Brussels facility. Kessler supervised German medical staff, coordinated with American administrators, and helped bridge cultural gaps between the two systems. Richter's conversations with Kessler during rehabilitation sessions revealed the German doctor's profound reassessment of both medical systems and broader military cultures. Kessler had served in Wehrmacht Medical Corps since 1939, treating wounded across Poland, France, and Russia before his capture. His experiences provided basis for comparison that shocked him. In German military hospitals, we triaged based on combat value and racial ideology. SS received priority care. Essential combat troops got what they needed. Everyone else made do with less. I performed surgery in Russia where we'd amputate without anesthesia to preserve scarce supplies for critical cases. We let thousands die from wounds that could have been treated because resources were allocated elsewhere. I accepted this as military necessity, as the harsh requirements of total war. The doctor paused, organizing thoughts that clearly troubled him. Then I see this American system. They've built hospitals for enemy prisoners that rival the best civilian facilities in Germany. They've assigned skilled surgeons and specialized staff to treat German wounded. They've shipped plasma and medications across an ocean to save enemy lives. The investment defies any military logic I understand, yet they maintain it systematically, not as propaganda but as policy. I've watched American doctors work 18-hour days caring for German soldiers, displaying the same dedication they show their own wounded. What drives this? What principle or ideology produces such behavior? Richter had no satisfactory answer. His conversations with Lieutenant Henderson and other Americans suggested a complex mix of legal obligation, pragmatic calculation, cultural values, and genuine humanitarian concern. Americans seem to actually believe their rhetoric about human dignity and universal rights, concepts Richter had dismissed as democratic weakness and sentimental nonsense. Yet here was the behavioral evidence, a massive systematic investment in enemy welfare that made sense only if Americans genuinely valued human life independent of nationality or usefulness. The implications unsettled Richter more than the physical wounds he was healing from. If Americans were sincere in their humanitarian principles, if they genuinely believed in universal human dignity, then everything about Nazi ideology's racial hierarchy collapsed into incoherence. The untermensch who supposedly lacked full humanity were building hospitals for their enemies. The mongrel democracy that should have been too weak for total war was winning through industrial might and organizational skill that exceeded Germany's vaunted efficiency. The corrupt capitalist system that propaganda portrayed as decadent and doomed was producing abundance that supported generous treatment of prisoners while Germany's superior racial state starved for basic supplies. The cognitive dissonance reached breaking point for many German prisoners during their medical treatment. Some retreated into denial, insisting that American care must be propaganda masking deeper cruelty that would emerge later. Others accepted the reality but walled it off psychologically, treating it as anomalous behavior that didn't challenge broader ideological assumptions. A smaller group, including Richter and Friedrich Werner, began the painful process of reassessing everything they'd believed about the war, their enemies, and their own nation's causes and methods. This reassessment accelerated as recovering prisoners discussed their experiences with newly captured Germans who brought fresh news from the front. By December 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated catastrophically for Germany. The Bulge offensive, Hitler's last gamble in the West, was collapsing with massive casualties. The Eastern Front was crumbling as Soviet forces drove toward the Reich's borders. American and British armies were positioning for the Rhine crossing that would carry them into Germany's heartland. Prisoners arrived daily with wounds from desperate defensive battles, each bringing tales of resources stretched to breaking, of units thrown into combat with inadequate training and equipment, of a military machine grinding itself to destruction. The contrast between Germany's collapse and American abundance grew starker. While German medical services disintegrated under the pressure of casualties and supply shortages, American POW hospitals continued functioning at high levels of care. Christmas 1944 brought Red Cross packages to German prisoners containing luxuries they hadn't seen in years. The medical staff organized holiday celebrations that would have seemed absurd except everyone participated with apparent sincerity. American chaplains offered religious services in German for prisoners who wanted them, respecting spiritual needs their captors could have ignored entirely. Richter spent Christmas in the Brussels hospital, his leg now strong enough to walk without crutches though rehabilitation continued. The American command authorized a special holiday meal for prisoners and staff that included turkey, real coffee, cigarettes, and chocolate. The abundance shocked Germans who'd survived on ersatz coffee and black bread for years. Lieutenant Henderson joined Richter and several other German prisoners for the meal, facilitating conversation between Americans and Germans who discovered shared humanity over turkey and small talk about families and hopes for peace. During that Christmas dinner, Richter found himself laughing at a joke Henderson told, something about American football traditions that didn't translate perfectly but conveyed warmth and humor. The moment crystallized his complete ideological transformation. He was sharing a meal with the enemy, finding common ground with men he'd been trained to view as inferior mongrels, recognizing in American soldiers the same humanity, complexity, and capacity for kindness that supposedly belonged exclusively to the Herrenvolk. The entire structure of racial ideology that had shaped his identity and guided his military service collapsed under the weight of lived experience that contradicted every premise. Friedrich Werner voiced what many prisoners were thinking. "We've been lied to about everything, haven't we? About the Americans, about the war, about what our nation was fighting for. They told us we were defending civilization and German culture from inferior races who wanted to destroy us. But the Americans are the ones acting civilized. They're the ones respecting human dignity and following moral codes. We're the ones who burned villages and shot prisoners and built extermination camps. How do we live with having served that? How do we go home knowing what our nation truly was?" The questions haunted the German prisoners as winter deepened into 1945 and Nazi Germany's final collapse accelerated. News from home brought increasingly desperate reports of cities bombed into rubble, of refugees fleeing the Soviet advance, of a nation reaping the catastrophic harvest of 12 years of Nazi rule. American newspapers circulated among literate prisoners, reporting the liberation of concentration camps with photographs and testimony that many Germans initially dismissed as propaganda until the evidence became overwhelming. The full scope of Nazi atrocities emerged gradually, forcing prisoners to confront their complicity in a regime whose depths of depravity exceeded their worst imaginings. For Richter, the reckoning came through a series of newspaper articles about Buchenwald's liberation in April 1945. The photographs showed emaciated survivors, mass graves, evidence of systematic murder on industrial scales. American soldiers who discovered the camp stood among corpses and living skeletons, their faces displaying shock and revulsion at what German civilization had produced. The articles quoted statements from camp survivors about medical experiments, about mass shootings, about gas chambers and crematoria operating around the clock to dispose of millions of murdered innocents. Richter read these accounts in the Brussels hospital's day room, surrounded by German prisoners who'd spent months receiving medical care from the very nation whose people had been systematically slaughtered. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. Americans were healing Germans who served the regime that murdered American Jews, Polish Jews, Russian Jews, Jews from across Europe along with millions of others deemed unworthy of life. The American medics working 18-hour shifts to save German limbs and lives knew what Germany had done, knew about the camps and the atrocities, yet continued providing care based on principles of human dignity that their patients' nation had utterly repudiated. Lieutenant Henderson found Richter sitting alone that evening, staring at the newspaper photographs with tears streaming down his face. The translator sat quietly for several minutes before speaking. "It's a lot to process, isn't it? Learning that your country committed evil on that scale while you were fighting for it. Many of you didn't know, or knew only fragments, or suspected but couldn't verify. But now you know. The question is what you do with that knowledge." Richter struggled to articulate the guilt and shame overwhelming him. "I fought for them. I commanded men who killed for that regime. I believed we were defending our nation and our culture. But we were just enabling mass murder. How do you live with that? How do your people treat us with kindness knowing what our nation did?" Henderson considered the question carefully. "Because we believe that you're not identical to your regime, that individual Germans can recognize evil and choose differently, that humanity persists even in people who serve terrible causes. We're treating you with dignity because we believe human dignity is universal and inalienable, not something that can be lost through guilt or association. What Germany did was evil. What individual Germans choose to do now that they know the truth will define who you become. That's why we're bothering to keep you alive and healthy. We believe you can choose to be better than what you were trained to be." The conversation continued late into the night as Henderson and Richter discussed moral responsibility, collective guilt, the possibility of redemption, and the challenge of building something better from catastrophic failure. The translator shared his own struggles with anger toward Germany for the evil it had unleashed, his professional obligation to treat German prisoners humanely regardless of his feelings, his hope that education and exposure to democratic values might help Germans build something different after the war. Henderson represented the complexity of American thinking about the enemy, capable of simultaneously acknowledging German crimes, maintaining fury at those crimes, and extending humanitarian treatment to individual Germans based on principles larger than revenge or tribal loyalty. Similar conversations occurred throughout POW facilities as Germany's collapse forced prisoners to confront uncomfortable truths about what they'd served. The German medical officers like Oberarzt Kessler played crucial roles in helping prisoners process these realizations. Kessler spoke bluntly about Germany's moral failure, about the medical profession's collaboration with Nazi atrocities, about the experiments and murders committed by doctors who'd betrayed their healing oaths. He challenged German prisoners to recognize the contrast between American medical ethics and German medical crimes, to understand that the humane treatment they'd received represented principles their own nation had abandoned. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, the Brussels hospital housed over 1,000 German prisoners in various stages of recovery. The news of surrender brought mixed reactions. Relief that the killing had finally stopped mixed with anxiety about what would happen next, about whether American treatment would continue now that the fighting was over, about the fate awaiting them in a defeated Germany. Some prisoners expected conditions to deteriorate now that military necessity for good treatment had ended. Instead, American policy maintained the same standards, continuing to provide care and rehabilitation for German prisoners even as the military transitioned to occupation duties. The American commitment to Geneva Convention standards persisted into the post-war period despite enormous pressure to retaliate for German atrocities. Public opinion in America demanded harsh treatment for Germans. Politicians called for using German prisoners as slave labor to rebuild what Germany had destroyed. Military commanders dealing with the challenges of occupation and the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union wanted to redirect resources from prisoner care to other priorities. Yet the medical system continued operating, the plasma kept flowing, the surgeries continued, the rehabilitation proceeded according to established protocols. Richter witnessed this continuity during his final months in American custody before repatriation. His leg had healed fully, leaving only a slight limp and some scarring as reminders of the wounds that should have killed him. He'd regained full function and could walk, run, and perform normal activities without limitation. The American surgeons who'd saved his leg took professional satisfaction in their successful outcome, treating him as a case study in proper surgical technique rather than as a former enemy. They published a medical journal article about the fasciotomy procedure that saved his limb, using his case to teach other surgeons about managing combat wounds complicated by infection. In July 1945, Richter attended a lecture at the hospital where American medical officers presented findings from their treatment of German prisoners over 2 years of war. The statistics they presented revealed the scope of American commitment to enemy medical care. Over 300,000 German prisoners had received medical treatment in American custody in the European theater. Mortality rates for wounded German prisoners closely matched rates for American casualties with equivalent injuries, indicating equivalent care standards. Survival rates for critical injuries exceeded what German military hospitals achieved for Wehrmacht soldiers. Hundreds of specialized surgical procedures had been performed on German prisoners, saving limbs and lives that would have been lost to amputation or death in German medical system. The lecture concluded with reflections on medical ethics in wartime and the importance of maintaining humanitarian standards regardless of enemy behavior. The presenting officer, a colonel who'd commanded medical services for an entire army group, spoke about the purpose behind American policy. We treated German prisoners according to our values, not theirs. We maintained medical ethics because abandoning those ethics would have made us complicit in the degradation of civilization that this war represented. Every German soldier we saved, Every limb we preserved, every infection we cured was an act of affirmation that human dignity transcends nationality and ideology. We're not naive. We know many of you served evil purposes. But we believe that treating you humanely served purposes larger than revenge or military necessity. We believe it demonstrated what civilization means and what principles worth fighting for look like in practice. Richter sat in the audience listening to this explanation of why Americans had saved his life, why they'd invested enormous resources in caring for enemies who'd tried to kill them, why they'd maintained humanitarian standards when abandoning those standards would have been easier and cheaper. The colonel's words validated what Richter had observed and experienced over 9 months in American captivity. American treatment of German prisoners hadn't been propaganda or anomaly. It had been systematic implementation of principles that Americans genuinely believed in, values so deeply embedded in their national culture that even total war couldn't override them. The experience fundamentally transformed Richter's understanding of power, civilization, and what nations owed to friends and enemies alike. He'd been raised to believe that strength meant ruthlessness, that weakness meant showing mercy, that racial hierarchy determined worth, that total war justified any measure necessary for victory. American power, demonstrated through industrial might and military success, had been tempered by humanitarian constraints that somehow enhanced rather than diminished that power. The nation strong enough to defeat Germany without abandoning its principles proved more formidable than the totalitarian regime that acknowledged no limits on its brutality. This recognition shaped Richter's post-war life after repatriation to Germany in early 1946. He returned to a nation in ruins, physically devastated and morally bankrupt, facing the enormous task of rebuilding not just infrastructure but the ethical foundations of German society. Richter settled in Hamburg, working initially in reconstruction efforts before eventually pursuing medical studies. The American doctors who'd saved his life had inspired him to enter healing professions, to embody in his own practice the humanitarian principles he'd witnessed in American military medicine. He wasn't alone in being transformed by American POW medical treatment. Friedrich Werner became a physical therapist, dedicating his career to rehabilitation work influenced by the therapy that restored his function after devastating abdominal wounds. Oberarzt Heinrich Kessler returned to surgical practice in Munich, teaching a generation of German medical students about ethics in medicine and the importance of resisting ideological pressures to compromise humanitarian principles. Throughout Germany, former prisoners who'd experienced American medical care carried those lessons into post-war careers, becoming advocates for humanitarian values in democratic institutions. The broader impact of American POW treatment extended beyond individual transformations to influence post-war German society's reconstruction. German prisoners who'd witnessed American democracy in action, who'd experienced the contrast between totalitarian ideology and democratic values, who'd been treated with dignity despite having served evil, formed a constituency for democratic reform. They understood from direct experience that alternatives to authoritarianism existed, that individual rights and human dignity could be protected even in military contexts, that power could be exercised within ethical constraints. This influence shaped the Federal Republic of Germany's constitution and political culture. The Basic Law adopted in 1949 incorporated strong protections for human dignity, explicit rejection of totalitarian ideologies, and commitment to international law. These principles reflected lessons learned from Nazi catastrophe, but they were reinforced by experiences of Germans who'd witnessed how democratic nations balanced strength with humanitarian values. The transformation accelerated as spring arrived in 1945. Werner organized discussions among recovering prisoners, creating spaces where Germans could process their disillusionment together. These gatherings became informal education sessions where former enemies debated democracy, human rights, and the moral foundations that separated civilization from barbarism. American chaplains joined these conversations, offering perspectives on redemption and moral reconstruction. They emphasized that recognizing past evil was the first step toward choosing differently. Many prisoners who'd never questioned authority began articulating criticisms of totalitarianism, seeing clearly how ideology had blinded them to atrocity. The medical staff encouraged this transformation. They understood that healing bodies without addressing minds left the work incomplete. German prisoners needed not just functioning limbs but functioning moral compasses. The Americans invested in both, believing that Germans who understood democratic values would help rebuild Europe rather than threaten it again. Kessler worked tirelessly to prepare German medical personnel for repatriation. He taught them American techniques but emphasized the ethical framework underlying those methods. Medicine existed to serve humanity, not ideology. Doctors owed allegiance to healing, not political systems. These principles had been abandoned in Nazi Germany with catastrophic results. The Brussels facility became a laboratory for democratic re-education. Americans didn't lecture or indoctrinate. They demonstrated through action what they believed. The consistency between stated values and actual behavior proved more persuasive than any propaganda. Prisoners witnessed principles in practice, making abstract concepts concrete and believable. Henderson spent hours with Richter discussing post-war possibilities. Germany would need leaders committed to democracy, people who understood both the depths Germany had fallen to and the heights other nations had reached. Former prisoners, having experienced contrast between systems, could become advocates for transformation. The idea resonated with Richter. He'd commanded men in service of evil. Perhaps he could lead differently in peacetime, using authority to build rather than destroy. The leg that American surgeons saved would carry him forward into a different future, one where his experiences informed choices that honored the humanity he'd finally learned to recognize. May brought Germany's surrender and mixture of relief with uncertainty. The killing stopped, but questions about the future multiplied. Prisoners wondered whether American benevolence would continue now that military necessity had ended. Would they be used as slave labor? Would retaliation replace mercy now that propaganda value had diminished? The answer emerged gradually. American policy remained unchanged. The Geneva Convention obligations persisted in peacetime. Medical care continued at the same standards. Rehabilitation programs proceeded on schedule. The consistency demonstrated that American principles weren't tactical decisions to be abandoned when convenient, but genuine commitments maintained regardless of circumstances. This revelation proved as transformative as the initial medical care. Americans meant what they said about human dignity. They'd built systems reflecting those values and maintained them through war and peace. The steadfastness validated everything prisoners had observed, confirming that democratic ideals could withstand the pressures that totalitarian systems used to justify their brutality. Liberation of concentration camps brought the final reckoning. Photographs circulated showing mountains of corpses, gas chambers, crematoria. American soldiers forced German civilians to tour the camps, to witness what had been done in their name. Prisoners in Brussels received the same documentation, the same photographic evidence of industrial-scale murder. The confrontation with absolute evil shattered remaining illusions. Some prisoners retreated into denial, unable to accept that their nation had committed such atrocities. Others collapsed under guilt's weight, seeing themselves as complicit in unprecedented horror. A third group, including Richter, faced the truth directly and began the difficult work of moral reconstruction. American responses to German confrontation with Nazi crimes revealed remarkable restraint. Medical personnel could have indulged in recrimination, reminding German prisoners that victims of camps received no care while German soldiers got world-class treatment. Instead, they maintained professional distance while acknowledging the obscenity of what Germany had done. This restraint communicated more powerfully than accusations would have. Americans were better than the system Germans had served. They'd proven it through actions sustained over years. The moral superiority was evident in every surgery performed, every wound cleaned, every rehabilitation completed. Germans had no defense, no justification, no excuse. Richter's repatriation came in early 1946. He returned to Hamburg carrying his medical records, documentation of the surgeries and care that saved his life. The city lay in ruins, a landscape of rubble punctuated by occasional standing walls. Millions were homeless. Food was scarce. The occupation authorities struggled to maintain order while preventing starvation. In this devastation, Richter found his purpose. He enrolled in medical school, determined to become the kind of doctor who'd saved him. The path was difficult. Resources were scarce. Many faculty had collaborated with Nazi medical crimes and were under investigation. But Richter persevered, driven by the example American physicians had set. Werner followed a similar path into physical therapy. Kessler resumed his surgical practice, teaching ethics alongside technique. Throughout Germany, former prisoners applied lessons learned in captivity to the monumental task of national reconstruction. They'd witnessed alternatives to authoritarianism. They'd experienced dignity when they deserved none. They carried those insights into a devastated nation desperate for new foundations. The impact rippled across decades. Former prisoners became teachers, business leaders, politicians, professionals who'd learned that democracy wasn't weakness and that humanitarian principles strengthened rather than undermined national power. They formed a constituency for democratic reform, understanding from experience why Germany needed constitutional protections and integration with democratic Europe. Richter practiced medicine in Hamburg for 40 years. He never forgot the American surgeon who'd saved his leg or the medics who'd treated an enemy with the same care they gave their own. He taught his students about medical ethics, about the obligations physicians owed to all patients regardless of nationality or circumstance. In 1984, 40 years after his capture, Richter traveled to the United States to attend a medical conference. He sought out veterans groups, hoping to find the medical personnel who'd treated him. Through patient inquiry, he located the surgeon, now retired and living in Baltimore. The reunion was emotional, with Richter expressing gratitude for the life he'd been given and the example that had shaped his career. The surgeon, gracious and modest, deflected the praise. He'd simply done his job, following the principles he'd been taught and the obligations international law imposed. Thousands of other American medical personnel had done the same throughout the war. The real credit belonged to a system that valued human life and a nation that maintained humanitarian standards even when easier alternatives existed. But Richter persisted. The surgeon's humility exemplified what separated democracies from dictatorships. In totalitarian systems, power demanded recognition and submission. In democracies, power was exercised through service and constrained by principles. The difference was everything, the line between civilization and barbarism. The conversation turned to broader reflections on the war and its aftermath. Both men acknowledged the catastrophe that Nazi Germany had unleashed, the millions dead, the civilization nearly destroyed. They discussed how German prisoners' experiences in American custody had influenced post-war reconstruction, providing templates for democratic institutions and humanitarian values. The surgeon shared his own journey, the challenges of maintaining professional detachment while treating enemies, the anger at German atrocities balanced against obligations to individual patients, the hope that showing Germans better alternatives might help prevent future catastrophes. The medical treatment had been professional, but the motivation included belief that Germans could change if exposed to different values. Richter confirmed that the strategy had worked. The contrast between what he'd been taught and what he'd experienced had shattered his indoctrination completely. Witnessing American principles in action had proven more persuasive than any re-education lecture. The cognitive dissonance had forced fundamental reassessment of everything he'd believed. Their conversation continued through the evening, two old men reflecting on choices made decades earlier and their long consequences. The surgeon had saved countless German lives, following protocols and principles without knowing which patients would carry those lessons forward. Richter had been one among thousands, yet he'd taken the experience and built from it a career dedicated to the values he'd encountered as a prisoner. As they parted, Richter offered final thoughts on the meaning of his wartime medical care. Americans had demonstrated that strength and mercy weren't contradictory, that power could be exercised within ethical constraints, that maintaining humanitarian principles during total war was possible and strategically valuable. Germany had learned these lessons through catastrophic defeat. Former prisoners helped ensure those lessons shaped reconstruction. The legacy of American POW medical treatment extended far beyond individual lives saved. It had planted seeds of democratic values in hostile ground, demonstrated alternatives to totalitarianism in action, and helped create the constituency for transformation that rebuilt Germany as a democratic state integrated with Europe. The investment in enemy welfare had paid strategic dividends beyond any propaganda value. Richter returned to Germany carrying renewed conviction that the principles he'd witnessed remained vital. New generations needed understanding that civilization required more than economic prosperity or military strength. It demanded commitment to human dignity transcending nationality, adherence to ethical principles regardless of convenience, and recognition that power without limits destroyed everything it touched. He taught these lessons to medical students, emphasizing that their profession carried moral obligations beyond technical competence. Doctors served humanity, not ideologies. They maintained standards regardless of patients' identities. They embodied principles that separated healing from harm, civilization from barbarism, hope from despair. The story of American medical treatment of German POWs demonstrates that maintaining humanitarian standards during war serves purposes beyond immediate military necessity. It validates principles worth defending, demonstrates contrasts between systems in conflict, and plants seeds of transformation in defeated populations. The investment in enemy welfare proved strategically wise and morally essential. For individual Germans like Richter, the experience provided education no classroom could match. Witnessing principles in action, experiencing dignity when expecting death, observing consistency between stated values and behavior, these lessons shaped trajectories that influenced post-war reconstruction. The Americans who saved German lives helped create the Germans who rebuilt democratic institutions. The broader lesson transcends specific historical circumstances. How nations treat enemies reveals character more clearly than how they treat allies. Maintaining humanitarian principles under pressure demonstrates commitment to values rather than expedient posturing. The choice to heal rather than harm, to treat enemies as humans deserving dignity, defines civilization itself. American medical personnel who treated German prisoners followed protocols and principles without knowing their long-term impact. They saved lives because their system demanded it, their training prepared them for it, and their values made abandoning wounded unthinkable regardless of nationality. The cumulative effect of thousands of individual treatment decisions rippled across decades. Germany's transformation from Nazi dictatorship to democratic state involved many factors. Allied occupation policies, economic reconstruction, generational change, and constitutional reforms all contributed. But the foundation included Germans who'd experienced alternatives to totalitarianism, who'd witnessed democracy in action, who'd learned that humanitarian principles enhanced rather than weakened national power. Former prisoners carried these lessons into post-war careers, becoming advocates for democratic reform and European integration. They understood from experience why Germany needed constitutional protections, independent judiciary, civilian control of military, and integration with democratic neighbors. They'd seen better alternatives and worked to implement them. The Americans who treated German prisoners demonstrated that maintaining humanitarian standards during total war was possible and valuable. They proved that adhering to Geneva Convention obligations served strategic purposes beyond immediate military calculations. They validated principles worth defending through the simple act of healing enemies who'd tried to kill them. This legacy endures in international humanitarian law, in medical ethics, in democratic values that distinguish civilization from barbarism. The choice to treat enemies humanely, to maintain principles under pressure, to recognize shared humanity transcending nationality, these decisions define what nations fight for and what victories mean. Richter's journey from ideological soldier to democratic physician encapsulates this transformation. American medical care didn't just save his leg. It saved his capacity for moral reasoning, his recognition of human dignity, his understanding that alternatives to totalitarianism existed. The physical healing enabled the moral healing that shaped his life's work. Decades after the war, Richter reflected on the improbable path from battlefield to medical practice. An American surgeon's decision to treat an enemy according to professional ethics had rippled through time, influencing thousands of patients Richter treated, students he taught, colleagues he mentored. One act of humanitarian care, multiplied by thousands of similar acts, had helped transform a nation. the lesson remains vital. How we treat enemies during conflict reveals who we are more clearly than how we treat allies during peace. Maintaining humanitarian principles under pressure demonstrates genuine commitment to values rather than convenient posturing. The choice to heal rather than harm defines civilization itself, separating democratic societies from totalitarian alternatives. American medical treatment of German POWs stands as testament to the power of principles consistently applied. It proved that strength and mercy aren't contradictory, that power within ethical constraints proves more durable than unconstrained brutality, that investing in enemy welfare serves strategic purposes beyond propaganda. The legacy shaped post-war reconstruction and continues influencing international humanitarian law. For Germans like Richter who experienced American care, the lessons proved transformative. They witnessed democracy in action, experienced dignity when expecting death, observed principles maintained despite pressure to abandon them. These experiences shaped trajectories that influenced rebuilding democratic Germany. The Americans who saved German lives helped create Germans who rebuilt democratic institutions. The story concludes not with battlefield victory but with long-term transformation. American medical personnel couldn't know which German prisoners would carry their example forward, which lives saved would influence reconstruction, which acts of mercy would plant seeds of democratic values. They simply followed their principles, maintained their standards, and treated enemies as humans deserving dignity. That choice, multiplied across thousands of interactions, helped transform Germany from totalitarian state to democratic ally. It validated humanitarian principles as strategic assets rather than luxuries. It demonstrated that maintaining ethics during war served purposes beyond immediate military calculations. The investment in enemy welfare paid dividends across generations. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.